Mr. Ian Campbell. Ian Campbell, you see, is from the Planning Institute of Jamaica as Procurement Director. We have Mr. Andre Bennett, who is the Principal Consultant at Promethea Consulting Limited. And also to join us this morning is Mr. Jovel Barrett from the Ministry of Finance, the Office of Public Procurement Policy. And we just want to say a special welcome to everyone that is online for this webinar, Agile Procurement in a Crisis. When we think about Agile Procurement, just as an introduction, I try to define Agile Procurement. And the question I'm asking, and I want us to just all answer this question in the chat if you can, is procurement always linear? No, we know about the different steps in a procurement cycle. And if there was any definition for agile procurement, there are several words that would have to come to mind: the flexibility, the agility, of course, the collaboration, and the speed. And it is procurement that includes agile project management methodology. And of course, with everything where there are advantages, there are disadvantages, and some disadvantages with agility is that teams can be burnt out. There are some trade-off with other procurement objectives, and we are aware of the different procurement objectives: the efficiency, the inclusion of MSME suppliers when we're talking about public procurement, the efficiency, the transparency, the accountability, and fair treatment of suppliers. And of course, as I mentioned, there are disadvantages, but in any process we have disadvantages. We have principles and tools we can use to mitigate these disadvantages and these risks. Now, the principle of Agile, the Agile methodology, was first used in software development, and there are 4 foundational values around the Agile methodology, not Agile procurement, but the Agile methodology. And the first is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. The second is a working software over comprehensive documentation. The third, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And the fourth, responding to change over following a plan. Now, though these are the foundational values, of course, there are disadvantages. For example, when you're trading off documentation for getting things moving, when new persons come on board, the lack of documentation causes an issue. And if we know anything about good procurement, public or private, good record keeping is so important. Now, over the years, I've seen agility in procurement matter in various situations, whether we're building out greenfield projects, which is where we're building things up from scratch, in, for example, a new manufacturing plant, or we're responding to natural disasters. In 2023 in Turkey, we had a 7.2 magnitude earthquake. In 2025, we had Hurricane Melissa, and we have to respond quickly. So there are varying situations where in procurement, we need to apply the agile methodology, agile procurement, keeping it agile. Now, there are 10 steps. There are 10 core areas of the agile methodology and what it looks like in public procurement here. But we're talking about having a vision or mission, clarifying what procurement initiatives we seek to achieve, having cross-functional team for specific projects. For example, your category managers, your procurement specialists, and your IT team, including project owners, having a product backlog. And a product backlog in the agile methodology sees us just sort of fleshing out all the tasks that are needed. For example, in procurement, what suppliers we need to onboard and which of those suppliers are priority. Contract drafting, the compliance check. What do we need? What compliance requirements do we need to meet? They are different depending on the type of procurement you need to execute on that project. We're talking about sprint, stand-up meeting, and incremental work. And again, these are steps in an agile methodology that can also be applied to procurement. For example, when we're talking about a sprint, we're talking about selecting tasks that can be completed quickly. We're talking about shortlisting specific suppliers, drafting the RFQs, and validate the compliance requirement. With your cross-functional teams having certain skill sets on board, you're able to move quickly. In GOJ, having the Public Procurement Commission at your fingertips, being able to reach them, get some clarification. I was having a conversation with a practitioner about donor funding, and you know they have a specific time to execute the contract to get the payment out. But then, of course, at the PPC, there's a certain timeline, sorry, to get a vendor in the registry. How can we get these things fast tracked? Having stand-up meetings, understanding whether it's on a weekly basis or on a daily basis, what are the bottlenecks, having them live, dealing with them. Then we also talk about the sprint reviews, the sprint retrospective, updated product backlog. For example, what do we mean in a procurement environment for a sprint review? Showcasing progress to our stakeholders. Hey, for this specific project, we needed to onboard 20 new suppliers. We're so far 3 suppliers ahead. These are the challenges. Let's brainstorm. How can we get this going? Okay, we have some overruns. We need to capitalize on some cost saving. Where are we with these initiatives that we wanted to prioritize on cost savings? Retroactive, sprint retroactive, that is. What went wrong? What didn't go well? Do we need to retender? Why did we have to retender? Because this is a critical project. We wanted to get this thing out within 2 weeks. We wanted to build this plant in a month, right? We wanted to build this classroom within 2 months, right? Why didn't we meet these specific objectives last week? Update product backlog. As you go along in these projects, using the Agile methodology, and being applied in procurement, you may realize that new tasks need to be added. Additional suppliers may need vetting. You may need to adjust your contract terms. You may need to go back to the drawing board, right? A supplier may not be performing. You may need to go back to market. You need to update the product backlog. You need to engage the stakeholders, get feedback, and remember, when we're thinking about agile methodology in procurement, flexibility is important and speed is important. I'm going to hand over to Ian as he sheds some light for the next 14 minutes on strategic planning.
Hope you're all doing well. And today I am going to look at the strategic element of agile procurement. So based on what Sanjay just indicated, the definition of agile procurement, what is agile procurement? Essentially, it's a way of acquiring solutions that focuses on desired outcomes rather than just sticking to fixed requirements. The approach values flexibility, as Sanjay mentioned, innovation, adaptability, and of course, collaboration. Those are key elements as it relates to agile procurement. And you will see the word flexibility throughout essentially because that's key for agility. Earlier, Sanjay indicated some of the drawbacks regarding going agile, but of course, there are benefits to it. And let's look at the benefits. It improves responsiveness by encouraging flexibility, adaptability in procurement processes. The Agile method significantly enhances responsiveness. It enhances collaboration. The Agile approach fosters teamwork among stakeholders, enabling them to tackle complex challenges from multiple angles. It increases efficiency. Implementing the Agile method enables procurement teams to work more effectively, prioritizing the delivery of results. It helps with decision making. The Agile approach fosters ongoing communication among stakeholders. In our case, it would be our MDAs and our economic operators. which of course leads to more informed decision making. Now, let's try to apply agility to how we do procurement in a crisis situation. For instance, Melissa's passing recently, which was so unfortunate for our country. So initially, it's crucial to assess the needs and requirements and establish a preliminary estimate of required works. Next, we should determine the best market approach. In this particular case, single source method is actually best because it's advantageous in terms of flexibility and collaboration. Essentially, assuming we are repairing, say, the PIOJ building that got damaged during the hurricane, right? This scenario essentially aligns with Section 21 2B of the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2025, which emphasizes protection of public property. Okay, to find a suitable economic operator, review completed procurements similar to the one in question on the Gojira platform. 3 activities would be ideal. Following that, we can reach out to our colleagues in other NDAs to complete client referral forms. The form should cover components such as cost control, contract execution, quality of work, adherence to timeline, the economic operator's responsiveness, and so on. A brief description of each item should be factored. Further, the form should feature a rating scale with appropriate descriptions and a score calculator. Additionally, the form should assess whether the contract price falls within a 15% margin above or below the estimate to gauge price reasonableness. Next, engage economic operator that received the highest rating and whose price falls within the tender estimate range. So essentially, in sending those client referral forms to your colleagues in other MDAs, they would basically provide their experience in dealing with those contractors that would have done similar works to the one that you're trying to actually do. Yeah. So this can inform you as to the best economic operators that can execute the procurement in question. It is important to inquire from the economic operator if they're interested in the project at hand and ask them when can they start, given that you're interested. Based on their response, invite them to submit a bid via a RFP, essentially. The RFP should allow for alternative methods to achieve the desired outcomes and include a section where the economic operator can make suggestions to improve the project requirements. It is advisable to focus the award criteria primarily on the adequacy of the key experts involved to ensure that the economic operator has the necessary skills for the repair works. Because guess what? People move on from jobs every day. So if NWA worked with a contractor and they had excellent results, if I'm taking them on, I want to know that the key experts are still available in that entity that can give me the same service, essentially, right? The same quality. That's particularly important. So the bidding documents, the award criteria really and truly should zoom in on the capabilities of the company, right? The personnel, can the personnel fulfill the requirements? That's very, very important. It is advisable to focus, as mentioned, during the tendering process, hosting Zoom meetings with the proponent to clarify any issues is encouraged, very important, because essentially you are trying to get a procurement over the line with 0 errors, essentially, right? With no delays are required here because we are trying to do an agile process. So at every phase, meetings are encouraged as necessary to ensure that everyone's on the same page. Because remember, we're collaborating here, right, to get something done quickly, right? Because a building essentially has been damaged and we need to get it fixed swiftly. So we have to encourage collaboration, have meetings as necessary to ensure that everyone's on the same page at all times. Yeah. Once this is secured, we can move to our contract award. Essentially, because we would have had meetings throughout and everyone being on the same page, negotiations will be seamless, easy, because there's ongoing dialogue during the tendering phase. So therefore, all the areas or nuances would have been addressed already. So we can easily award a contract in a timely manner. At the Institute, this is something that we have utilized and has actually worked. And of course, it is more suited for single source procurements, essentially. Because if you're trying to be competitive, you'll have challenges going agile. So essentially, you're best served to use a single source method. So just to recap, essentially, importantly, you have to engage the economic operator after you have consulted with your colleagues who have done similar procurements, essentially. So you can, of course, look at 3 and select the best one based on the response from your colleagues in other MDAs, essentially. And based on that, get the best one, approach them, invite them to bid, give them opportunity to add value to what you require, essentially, provide an alternative if one is out there, and essentially work together as quickly as possible to come to a contract, essentially. Colleagues, thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
I'm going to hand over to Mr. Jovel Barrett, who is going to now lead us in a presentation on exemptions and regulatory compliance.
So good morning again, everybody. I'm Jovel Barrett. I'm the Chief Public Procurement Policy Officer. Thank you, Sandre, for inviting me to this discussion. All right, so as Sandre mentioned, the government of Jamaica passed the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2025, which was intended to make it easier for procuring entities to do and conduct procurements in situations of emergency or, extreme urgency, as the case is now with Hurricane Melissa. Right. And the provisions in the amendment or in the Public Procurement Act that deals with emergency procurements now is the first schedule of the Public Procurement Act. And the effect of having the, procurements during situations of emergency or extreme urgency in the first schedule is that it is exempted from, the procurement methods and processes that are outlined in parts 3 and parts 4 of the Act. So, parts 3, and part 5. Part 5 of the Act, goes through and it tells you about, the procurement methods that you can use. It talks about the contract approval that would be required for tiers 1, tiers 2, tiers 3. All of that are not applicable to procurements during situations of emergency or extreme urgency. Another effect of the amendment is that the provisions outlined in the Public Sector Procurement Procedures Handbook dealing with emergency procurements are also no longer applicable, and so these have been superseded by the provisions outlined in the Act. Now, when you're doing procurements during situations of emergency, one of the things that is very important is to ensure that you're able to get goods, works, or services to where they're needed as quickly as possible. However, you must ensure that you are achieving value for money. Now, when we say value for money, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the goods at the lowest price. Value for money is basically, I mean, in a situation of emergency, is ensuring that you're getting the goods to where they need to go for a reasonable price. You know, you're balancing price, quality, and efficiency. And you know, you may not get there, or you may not get the lowest price in doing so. But persons need the goods and they need it quickly, but they need it at a reasonable price. So we're not looking at exorbitant prices. Now, the Act outlines that notwithstanding the fact that you are exempt from the normal procurement methods and processes, you are still subject to any financial limits set by the Financial Secretary, as well as any guidelines issued by the Office of Public Procurement Policy and the Chief Public Procurement Policy Officer. So as Sanjay would have mentioned, yesterday, the Office of Public Procurement Policy published guidance note number 2 of 2025, which outlines, you know, the methods, terms, and conditions under which procuring entities are allowed to conduct procurement in situations of emergency or extreme urgency. And I mean, it basically goes through a number of areas, which we'll go through some of them now. Of course, a failure to comply with the Act or any regulations or the guidance note will constitute a breach of the Act. The first, now, what is an emergency? Now, the Act in the first schedule defines an emergency as one that arises as a result of events not attributable to or foreseeable by the procuring entity, a disaster within the meaning of any enactment concerned with disaster risk management, a period of public disaster or period of public emergency proclaimed or declared under any enactment, or a disaster or emergency declared by the minister with responsibility for a procuring entity by notice published in the Gazette after consultation with the head of that entity. And importantly, it necessitates the award of a procurement contract to effect repairs or remedial action to safeguard the public interest or to protect infrastructure, property, or public monies from loss. Now, I mean, I know that is a lot. And I mean, one of the what I'd like to highlight here is what it means to safeguard the public interest. Now, I mean, I looked at a recent case which considered this issue, which outlines that public interest, I mean, is dealing with, you know, the general welfare of the public that warrants recognition and protection. Something in which the public as a whole has a stake, especially an interest that justifies government regulations. So, I mean, if we're talking about building back schools, you know, ensuring that persons, you know, are no longer living, you know, on the cardboards and things like that. I mean, the government needs to step in those situations to protect, you know, the life of people, to protect, I mean, the health of people, protect, you know, education system. So whatever is needed to, you know, do remedial action to safeguard those interests, the government is able to step in, and provided that any of the conditions outlined in the Act are satisfied, the government can go in and apply the emergency procurement procedures. Now, one of the effects of the exemption is that when it comes to contract approvals, as I'd have, you know, hinted at earlier, the head of a procuring entity may approve a contract, you know, regardless of the value or the procurement method utilized, sorry. And that is only subject to any fiscal responsibility considerations, which I will get into a little later. So, I mean, there's no longer a need in these situations to get approval from PPC, get approval from cabinet. There's no longer a $100 million limit on the approval that a head of procuring entity can do. So, you know, things are much simpler. You can get things done much more quickly. When it comes to procurement methods, Procuring entities may, in keeping with standards of sound public procurement or commercial procurement arrangements, and of course, in pursuit of value for money and the objectives of the act, deploy, such methods of procurement as the procuring entity is able to utilize when they're responding to a situation of emergency or extreme urgency. And that includes single source. If you have framework arrangements in place, you can use those. Request for proposal, restricted bidding, whatever method of procurement you believe best suits the situation, you are able to utilize those methods. So there's no restriction where the methods are concerned. When it comes to use of the standard solicitation documents, again, you are afforded more flexibility here. You don't have to use generally the standard solicitation documents. However, the guidance notes that has been issued outlines that, if you're procuring, goods, works, or services above the competition threshold for restricted competition, you must use the standard GOJ contract documents, right? So, not the solicitation documents, not your the contract documents you must use. And the reason for doing that is just so that we can ensure that, the guardrails that are set up in the contract documents still apply during a situation of emergency. Sometimes you have an emergency and you feel like, oh, you want to move quickly, and you don't end up considering, some of the standard provisions that you would normally have in a contract, and then start a contract, and then you realize that sufficient protections were not built into it. So for those higher value contracts, you must use the standard contract documents. However, for contracts below that the restricted competition value, you are permitted to use in-house contract documents, provided that they contain some some basic terms as outlined in the guidance note. When it comes to eligibility of suppliers, again, there is some flexibility. However, the preference is for procuring entities to engage suppliers who are registered and who are or who have been tax compliant at some point within the 12 months immediately preceding the award of a contract. So, the standard eligibility requirement is that you're tax compliant at the time of award of contract. What we're saying is you need to be tax compliant at some point within the last 12 months. So if you're not tax compliant now, that's fine. If you're tax compliant 6 months ago, 11 months ago, you are still permitted to engage with those persons, and that is the preference. Of course, you may have situations where, somebody is a life-threatening situation, you have to act quickly, and the person or the supplier who is able to react to that situation is not registered, not tax compliant, and so it's not prudent in those situations to insist on that requirement, then of course you are able to proceed. Of course, none of these requirements apply if you are awarding a contract below the single source competition threshold. So I don't expect that we'll have a lot of situations where you need to act and you are awarding a contract of $50 million. But if that is the case, the guidelines are there. When it comes to, and just to wrap up, for Hurricane Melissa, the report that is there is that we've lost 1/3 of our GDP, and what that means is that the money coming into government covers will start dwindling very, very, very quickly. And so insofar as we are now spending money to react to situations, we need to, as best as possible, to award contracts to persons who, are already in the system, have been known to be tax compliant at some point in time. TAJ already knows them, so when TAJ needs to go in and get their money, it's much easier so that we can keep the wheels turning. If we end up awarding significant contracts to persons who are not in the system, not known to be compliant, then in a couple months from now, we're in a situation where there's no revenue coming into government and things will grind to a halt. So, I mean, that is really the rationale for trying to, as best as possible, to engage with suppliers who have been known to be tax compliant. Of course, during these situations, we need to ensure that there's transparency. And so the Act requires that procuring entities publish a public notice of the contracts that they award. And the Office of Public Procurement Policy has done some system changes to GoJEP to allow for procuring entities to publish their contracts on GoJEP. And once they're published on GoJEP, then it's become public. Reporters, anybody who has an interest in, seeing what contracts have been awarded, that information will be on GoJEP. Now, I had mentioned before that when it comes to awarding contracts, head of entity can award regardless of value, but it's subject to fiscal responsibility considerations, and those considerations are, to ensure that the expenditure is within any approved budget ceiling that has been given to a procuring entity, or the expenditure has been approved by the financial secretary. I mean, avoid creating fiscal risk through commitments that exceed, available financing. So while we are in a crisis, no, we don't want to create a larger crisis by committing funds over and above the money that is available. So these are some of the considerations that you must have before you go out and you award contracts. Now, in every emergency, and I guess even before, as a country in the Caribbean, we must prepare for events like this. And so, heads of procuring entities must be responsible for developing and documenting a comprehensive emergency management procurement strategy that addresses, the key operational considerations for procurements. I mean, this include, identification of officers, clear reporting and communication channels, integration with organizational risk management, business continuity, and health and safety strategies, establishment of prearranged procurement arrangements in anticipation of, emergency needs, determination of appropriate delegations for responsible officers, during these type of situations so that you are able to respond quickly. Additionally, I mean, the staff need to be aware of, the procurement rules that apply when it comes to emergency situations, implement mechanisms to ensure that at the end of the day, we're not coming out of an emergency and entering a scandal. So you need to have robust management processes in place, internal controls to manage the situation. And of course, we need to ensure that the award of contracts during a situation of emergency or extreme urgency does not pose, conflicts of interest. Of course, sometimes this may not be avoidable. And so you just need to ensure that this is documented. And then of course, ensuring that the required reportings are done and, the expenditures, are reported where they need to be reported to. So these are generally the legal and compliance requirements when it comes to conducting procurements during situations of emergency. And I mean, the guidance note is there. It is available on the Procure JA website, and for you to all go through and read. Again, just want to emphasize that we need to act quickly. There is flexibility in the rules as they are now. However, there is also a need for accountability. All right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joel Barrett, the Chief Public Procurement Policy Officer there at the Ministry of Finance. And wow, a lot to be absorbed. Over to you, Andre, who has a presentation, a perspective of the legal and global insights. Over to you, Andre.
Thank you for the invitation to the Shelf team. From the Shelf team, it's my pleasure to meet with you. And you know, I'm always animated and excited to talk about the extraordinarily boring topic of public procurement. But it is the thing that I find very interesting. And I hope that you will find some of the discussions here interesting as well. Now, the thing that I always reprise on, if you've heard me before, you would remember that I always advocate for us to be very goal focused. Public procurement and the regulation of it does not exist in a vacuum. There are actually things that the government wants us to accomplish in our public procurement system. Some of these goals that are articulated are meant to be achieved in the country system, and then others are expected to be pursued directly in each and every single procurement transaction. We need to know what the goals are. We're not just pushing papers around. The whole point of public procurement is to actually get some things, right? Is to reach into the economy or into the economic markets and to strike a good deal, and therefore to deliver a valuable good or service to the citizens of Jamaica whose money has been entrusted to us. Okay? The thing that we sort of contend with all the time is that the goals that are articulated by government, whether that's the government of Jamaica in our act in section 5 of the existing act as amended, or in any other legislation or governing or guiding policy regarding public procurement, what you find is that there are a number of goals. These goals are individually important and they're collectively important. And they derive from some considerations that are necessary for the functioning of any government. So you have a set of goals that come from the fact that procurement is primarily about economics. Procurement is investing about 30% of gross domestic product each year into the economic markets in order to derive or extract value from the market and deliver, do something with the value derived, and then to deliver some good or service to the public at large, as I said before. In that respect, we expect to see things like competition. We expect to see things like value for money, which is a measure of economic efficiency. We expect to see things like economic development, right? Similarly, we have goals that derive from socio-political issues and considerations. There are a number of actors in the society, in the community, who may be disadvantaged. They might be traditionally disadvantaged economic actors, and government would say, well, in this project of investing all of this money, let's create a space for them. So you will see things like participation and enabling MSMEs, etc. Then you would identify that there are some legal issues, right? So in this multidisciplinary soup of considerations, you will find economic issues, socio-political issues, and legal issues. The legal issues generally bite when you ask questions like, well, of all the suppliers that are available, there are thousands of them. Which ones do you award contracts to? How do you come to that decision? In which respect, you would think about things like equal treatment or equitable treatment, things like transparency, fairness, and so on. In Jamaica's case, we sift out the suppliers. We first put up some hurdles and we say you must be admitted to a register that's maintained at the PPC. If you don't have a ticket, you don't have a chance. So we look at those suppliers and we say, of those ones that are registered, then which one? And then you would use some legal thinking to get to the answer. Now, the problem, of course, in a way, so the legislative framework is tuned to ensure that all of these objectives are met, and it elaborates specific and precise steps that are to be taken, and it elaborates systems that allow for checks and balances so that you can show that you're actually achieving the goals. Enter emergency. The problem that emergencies sort of deliver right, is that you do not have the time. People's lives are hanging in balance. People's liberty, people's safety and convenience and comfort are hanging in the balance. You do not have the time to pursue all of the very elaborate systems that are set up to achieve the goals. And so emergencies pose a real problem to procurement system goal achievement. And what you find is that there are two main issues arising. First, there is deformalization, and that's what I'm trying to describe in terms of now your inability to focus on all of the goals because you don't have all of the structures that you must follow. So if you look in the European Union, or if you look in Nigeria's COVID-19 response guidance, or if you look in the United States Federal Acquisition Regulations, or if you look in Jamaica's Act, what you will see, and in Barbados and in everywhere else that has articulated a public procurement law, you will see that in relation to emergency response, there is deformalization. There is now the opportunity to not honor the regular methods, to not pay attention to the regular approvals processes, to not pay attention to the regular checks and balances. And you will find that in Jamaica, for example, the entire architecture of emergency is now excluded, is now exempt from coverage of the Act, but not without the safeguards that have been issued by the Ministry of Finance recently. That's one challenge, it's the deformalization. The second challenge is the threat to value for money. Jovel spoke extensively about it, and I think Ian mentioned a bit about value for money, and Sandra as well. The whole point is that you don't want to be buying rubbish. And because of the compressed timeframes that are inherent in emergency response, you find that there's limited market consultation, you reduce competitive pressure, and you can't negotiate. And so therefore, you might find that there's a dilution of value for money, and the immediate focus on speed and availability may result in procuring entities overlooking total cost of ownership considerations, selecting solutions based solely on immediate availability rather than long-term value. And what that might therefore result in is that you buy the thing today in order to respond to the issue at hand, and then 2 months later you have to go buy it again. That is a waste of money. So emergencies really pose a problem to the things that we set out to accomplish. So what does the regulation do? How do regulators and what do regulatory frameworks generally provide for in response to this issue, in response to this threat? Well, there are two main things. One is the use of transparency. Now, transparency is a really important value, and it's of instrumental value. What it does, it enables us to achieve other things. In this case, the transparency serves as the primary defensive mechanism against corruption and misconduct. And if anybody tries to gaslight you into thinking that corruption is not an active consideration in emergency response, you run them away. The reality is that in the best of times, corruption is with us. In the worst of times, even more so. We just have to look to see what's going on in terms of people's treatment of displaced victims of Melissa, to see what men can do, what people can do, what humans can do. And so transparency operates to remove the information asymmetry and to reduce the moral hazard. Moral hazard is what describes that situation where a person calculates that it is better for them to act badly than to act appropriately. So if they feel like they won't be caught, or if they calculate that the price of being caught is less than the price that they will be able to extract for themselves, then they will go ahead and do corrupt things. So transparency is one important and critical measure. So you will see, for example, in Jamaica's approach, that there is a requirement that once an emergency arises, first of all, you can't just say that something is an emergency. It has to meet the threshold set by the Act. Then you must say why you think the thing is an emergency, and then you must tell the world at large, this is an emergency, this is how much we have spent in order to deal with the emergency, and this is the person to whom we have awarded contracts in order to deal with the emergency. The second thing is that there is this concept from Simpson called bounded rationality. Transparency helps to overcome that because it displaces some of the biases. You know, every single one of us as procurers, we have our inherent biases as to who we think can do certain things and to the state of the market. You know, once we start to employ transparency mechanisms into even emergency response, we can overcome some of those things because we can look for market information and therefore make some good choices. More to say about that, but I'm running against time. The second thing that you would see in relation to the strategies that governments generally undertake or employ is pre-positioning, early contracting, and framework contracting. And the simple idea is that instead of sitting down like a duck, instead of waiting like a sitting duck for some catastrophe to strike and for you to therefore try to make up the response, you would say to yourself, you live in an active hurricane zone, you live in an active earthquake zone. What are some of the things that will be needed in order to respond if these things should happen? Well, make we buy them from beginning and put them down. And so in that way, the cost of carrying inventory actually it overcomes and it compensates for the higher prices that you will have to pay in an emergency response or catastrophic response. Or you could utilize a framework agreement, or in the US, they call them IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, where you bring the suppliers into your sort of realm through a legal mechanism, and you say, once this thing happens, be ready to respond to us. And this could be for the supply of goods, for the supply of services, or to construct works. The point is, instead of sitting down and waiting to respond, we can be proactive. And you see that happening, and that encouraged in the European Union directives. You see it encouraged in the USA FAR. You see it encouraged in the Nigerian Act. And to an extent, it's encouraged in the Jamaican legislation. So there are a couple more things that I'd love to say, but maybe next time. I'm going to stop there and hope that this short presentation has provided some kind of food for thought, and my prayers and thoughts are with you if you've been directly affected by Hurricane Melissa.
When we talk about agile procurement, as we're winding down, right? We're not just talking about in the public procurement realm, but also in the private sector, in supply chain management. And I love something that you just shared, Andre, regarding some, what you call it, proactive mechanisms. And you're right. The IDIQs, the framework agreement, and sometimes it's some simple contract clause. I've had clauses in bidding documents where I need to know, based on the priority of these materials, what percentage of this volume you're bidding on for a specific quarter or a specific 6 months can you stock as floor inventory so that I may react quickly to customer demand. Now, of course, there's a trade-off between carrying costs and the price you're going to pay. And bidders are always going to consider these things as well when they're participating in a tender. But the truth is, in supply chains, you have 3 things flowing. And these things also flow in an emergency, in agility, and you want to keep them moving. And the 3 things are information, finances, and goods, right? In a supply chain, you have information that's flowing in both directions. You have goods being flown and moved in one direction from supplier to customer, or sometimes in the reverse, where you have reverse logistics happening, where there are some issues with the product, and you also have finances. And one of the things that we need to consider in preparing ourselves for emergencies is that, okay, you oftentimes have suppliers within your supply chain that require deposits, that require prepayment, and so on. And you want to prepare yourselves where you have these critical suppliers. Have your terms in place, have financing ready. And let me tell you something, and I saw it in the guidance notes and well, something which is true. I see it in both the public and the private sector. You have all these emergencies, you rush to get the works in place, you rush to get the goods in place, the goods come and they sit there, right? Now, if you ask me, and we all know those aren't real emergencies, but we have to prepare ourselves for them so that goods, information, and money can move freely. And we all know as well, where money isn't flowing well to our suppliers fail to participate in our procurement proceedings in the supply chain environment. So we have to ensure that these things are working so that when we are in that time of crisis, when we need to be fragile, when speed is important, when accuracy is important, it actually works. Now, just in terms of quick summary, the final note I'm sharing here is around monitoring and evaluation. Of course, Jovel mentioned, and it's also in the guidance note that, hey, and of course, in the private sector, we have policies as well. In the public sector, we're governed by the Public Procurement Act and the regulations. And for example, it speaks to sections 56(1)(e), and which says here, practices or is concerned in any fraudulent act to avoid the requirements of this act or regulation is considered an offense, right? So we want to be agile, and at the same time, we want to ensure that we're compliant. And for this to happen, of course, sometimes we're frustrated because things seem to not be working well for us. Things seem to take too long. All elements need to work well. We spoke about the Agile methodology earlier, whereas you have this project, you have this transaction you want to get done in an agile manner. You want to ensure that all your stakeholders are on board. Finance is ready, logistics is ready, the engineers are ready, right? Whatever the policies are, we want to ensure that we are compliant as well. Be agile, but be compliant. Also, Section 58 of the Act, of course, also mentions offense, and Jovel also alluded to it. And there's also compliance as it relates to our suppliers, right? They also have a part to play in this. I remember standing in front of some business owners. We're doing a training, and they are surprised as to the realm of persons who can be held accountable. 59.1, for example, says we're a body corporate, and this is now where the private sector has a role to play. Where a body corporate commits an offense against this act, every director, manager, secretary, or other similar officer concerned with the management of the body corporate is a party to the offense and is liable to be convicted for the offense and to the punishment provided for the offense, whether or not the body corporate is prosecuted or convicted. And we know there's also a time frame on which, as a supplier, you can, not be eligible to participate after you have been convicted of an offense. So we want to ensure that all parties involved, because listen, we know after the emergency done, after the dust settles, the auditors are coming, right? The auditors, your internal audit department within your private sector firm, the Auditor General, the Integrity Commission within the public sector, when the dust settles, you want to ensure that things were done well, fast, agile, but compliant. When we talk about evaluations of as it relates to monitoring and evaluations, using ERP is so important. We're in an age of tech now. We want to ensure that our procurement transactions are being executed through ERP systems. We have a variety of them in the private sector. The GoJep in the public sector. We have, Jovel mentioned the manual entry requirement. There is a guide on the Procure JA website, and emergency situations can often involve expedited processes, which can increase risk of fraud, corruption, and misuse of funds. Again, want to ensure that when the dust settles and the auditors come, everything is okay. Risk management, want to ensure that as we run procurement transactions through softwares and ERP systems, we can use the data to identify risks. For example, over reliance on single source transactions. Remember, we never say reliance on, because it's important to use it, but over reliance are we using it for real emergencies? And of course, want to ensure that we publish this data to enhance stakeholder trust, reporting it to our management teams, reporting it to our boards in the private sector. Let our stakeholders know what is happening. Let us stakeholders know what part they also have to play in these proceedings. As we think about how we make and how we apply that methodology, just as a recap in terms of what it looks like applying it, as I said, have a vision and mission. And it's very similar to what we coach persons on as it relates to strategic sourcing and developing a strategic sourcing plan. Have a cross-functional team, have a product backlog. And when we say product backlog, we mean as best as possible, flesh out all the tasks that are required so you can prioritize them, right? Have your sprints. So your sprints are those meetings and those goals that you can achieve within a 1 to 2 week period. Having the stand-up meeting because you want to keep, there's an over-reliance on communication and communication well, efficiently with the Agile methodology. Incremental work, which is instead of waiting for the entire sourcing cycle, secure one supplier, get some things done now that can be done now. Sprint review, showcase progress to stakeholders, let people know what's up, what is happening, what is the progress. Sprint retrospective, when you meet what went well, what didn't go well. Update the project backlog. You may have some new tasks that need to be added. Again, it's Agile, things are changing, the wheels are turning. Be flexible. And then finally, repeat, achieve, adapt, and comply. We're saying be agile, but be compliant. I want to say thank you so much for all the persons that came out. My friends or friends in the private sector, the public sector, thank you very much. Mr. Jovel Barrett, the Chief Public Procurement Policy Officer at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. Thank you, Mr. Andre Bennett, the Principal Consultant of Prometheus Consulting Limited. You can link Andre and his team up for procurement reform, tearing your process apart, making it better as Prometheus Consulting. Thank you so much, Ian from the Planning Institute of Jamaica, for your keen insight on strategic planning. And thank you for my team here at the Shell Procurement Solutions Limited, doing the hard work making this webinar happen. And of course, as it says on the screen, you can link us at the Shell Procurement Solutions Limited. Many of you guys here would have been at our trainings and previous webinars as well. So we appreciate your support. Thank you so much. And from the team at the Shelf, we say have a wonderful day and keep doing the good work as we do in procurement. Take care.